This is another episode of the Anti-Intellectual Intellectual by Scott McIntyre. Once again, looking at the brilliance of our intellectual class. And on this particular episode, we're going to look at Freakonomics again and cognitive psychology in general, how they get it wrong when it comes to human rationality. The assumption is basically that, again, humans aren't rational. I mentioned I was going to talk about this one in previous videos. This is the third point I was trying to make about the Freakonomics effort to show humans are irrational. They basically follow the lead of psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who we're going to talk about a little bit later in the video. But in this particular podcast that was in Freakonomics in January 2017, they said this: ideas that revolved around a central realization that when most of us make decisions, we essentially ignore the laws of probability and even logic, that we instead rely on primitive rules of thumb and shortcuts, or heuristics in the language of academia, that are prone to error. And we typically give adverse events a lot more weight than positive events. And so some of those statements that I have there in red are essential to understanding this idea that humans are irrational. Rationality is defined by how well decisions match probability calculations, and they mention in this case even logic. We're going to show in this episode again how those probability calculations are in error, and how there are different forms of logic that humans do conform their thinking to, and that prone to error, well, that just again depends on what are the mathematical calculations you're using to determine whether it's an error or not. So Freakonomics is largely built on this idea that is found in behavioral economics, that humans are irrational in their thinking. They can't do the math, they're emotional. And in this, Levitt and Dubner follow Dr. Daniel Kahneman and his partner Amos Tversky in their research that tried to show that humans are not rational, or at least not in some sense. Initially, it was in reference to a theory called expected utility theory, but they also demonstrate how humans aren't rational in other ways too, according to their definitions. Well, if we define rationality narrowly as anything that matches a probability calculation, then anything that doesn't match a probability calculation is irrational, and that carries the connotations of being stupid and emotional and without reason, without logic, as was said earlier. That's not particularly flattering for you and I, but I think there's good evidence that shows that Freakonomics, Kahneman, and many other cognitive psychologists, behavioral economists are simply wrong about this. You can go back to some of my other videos where we talk about pools versus guns, your probability of getting struck by lightning, getting bitten by a shark or eaten by a shark, what's safer, air transportation or ground transportation. And in those videos, I show clearly, I think, that the probability calculations that are used by these intellectuals are simply wrong. So if we base human rationality on meeting those incorrect probability calculations, then we have a flawed view of the human nature. And second, even when these probability calculations could be accurate, which I think for the most cases is impossible, but even when it is possible, like let's say when it comes to gambling or something like that, there's really no objective reasons humans or animals should favor calculating probabilities in their decisions over another type of strategy, which would be a cost versus payoff strategy that's biased for staying alive. This kind of logic was used by an old school mathematician, Blaise Pascal, in the 16th century. It's also signal detection theory also helps explain this type of decision making, and which I liken to the Mama Gump mantra, stupid is as stupid does. And we'll look at some of those later in the video, but for now, let's look at whether rationality depends on us matching probability calculations. So we go back to Kahneman and Tversky and their research in the 70s and 80s. And they argued with their research that humans do not follow the expected utility theory for making decisions. And they argued that there are two things in their research that assumptions that they make. The first is that Kahneman and Tversky's lab simulations are equivalent to real world decisions. So do their simulations really represent human decision making outside the lab? That's a serious consideration. And secondly, is human rationality determined by how well decisions match calculations of probability distributions? So these are some challenges to Kahneman and Tversky's research and expected utility theory. But for Kahneman and Tversky, as an example of the research they did to show that humans are irrational, I'll present a little story problem and some of the research. They argued through their data, they showed that if people were presented with an opportunity to save $5 on a $15 item or $5 on a $125 item, that people said that they would drive to another store to save $5 on a $15 item, whereas few of them would do so for the $125 item. Now, according to their theory of rationality, or expected utility theory anyway, $5 is $5. It's the same amount you're saving on each item, so it should be a 50-50 distribution for the $15 item and the $125 item. But more people consistently said they would do that for the $15 item. They would drive to save the $5. So that doesn't match this idea that $5 is $5 according to expected utility. So Kahneman and Tversky, seeing that people weren't conforming to that theory, came up with their own theory they called prospect theory to account for those anomalies. But really, their theory was still married to decision-making matching certain probabilities. And their theory was still married to that idea of probability calculations. And the main difference being that instead of maybe a linear function, theirs had an S-shaped curve to the function of probability. And they also said that we used several heuristics like the availability heuristic and representativeness, that while supposedly being highly economically and usually effective, also cause serious and systematic errors. How's that for scientific certainty for you? So their theory, the prospect theory, also showed that we were largely irrational. We didn't follow probability functions, and they tried to explain it through psychological factors and the use of heuristics that were trying to save cognitive functioning and other sorts of bias. Kahneman also bemoaned the fact that we commit elementary errors in logic, like the gambler's fallacy. An example of that is assuming that a heads on a coin flip is due after a sequence of many tails. And he argued that statistically sophisticated people avoid those kinds of errors. That's you, right? Not the intellectuals, right? But that very idea that a gambler is saying that a heads is due after a long run of tails, I would say is not really an error. It's not a fallacy at all. Why? Because there's also a principle in mathematics called the law of large numbers that says over a long run distribution that the expected value for that distribution will match the expected value for individual occurrences. So in a coin flip where there's a 50-50 chance at heads or tails, each flip is a 50-50 shot. But also over the long run, the distribution will look 50% heads, 50% tails. So could it be that we know that also intuitively, that of course each flip is 50-50, but the gambler, after a long run of tails, knows that due to this law of large numbers, that eventually it has to eventually turn back to a heads coming up. So it's no worse to expect a heads than a tails on the next flip. And so why wouldn't it make sense for a gambler to choose heads after a long run of tails? Because it might even add in this law of large numbers, assuming that maybe at some point it's got to switch back to heads. And so even if it's infinitesimally small chance that it's going to go to heads, that you might as well pick heads because it's no worse than picking tails. So I'm just arguing there that maybe this gambler's fallacy is not really a fallacy at all. That when taking into account this law of large numbers, it makes sense for gamblers to expect that a heads or a tails is due after a long run of the opposite. That's kind of on the side. But one professor that has challenged Kahneman's conclusions about human rationality is Gerd Gigerenzer, and he used a story problem to illustrate why these probability calculations to judge the rationality of human decision making are flawed. He gave the example of that's in the white box here that says if you live in a jungle and today you must choose between two alternatives to let your child swim in a river or let them climb in the trees. Use only one criterion for that choice, your child's life expectancy. And you know that in the last 100 years, there was only one accident in the river in which a child was eaten by a crocodile, whereas in that same time, a dozen children had been killed falling from trees. So just yesterday, your neighbor told you that her child was eaten by a crocodile. Where do you send your child? Well, the intellectuals must argue that you still send your child to the river because the probabilities have only changed minutely. Before that child was eaten, it was death by crocodiles 1 in 100 years, death in the trees 12 in 100 years, and now it's only changed to death by crocodiles 2 in 100 years and death in trees 12 in 100 years. So the intellectuals have to ignore that new information. They have to hold to the probability distributions and choose to send their child to the river. What are you going to do? Well, choosing to send your child to the trees to play doesn't make you irrational, as those mathematicians using statistical calculations of probability would have you think. Mathematician Blaise Pascal, also somebody who calculated probabilities, especially in gambling, he spent a lot of time thinking about that. He made an interesting argument about when it made sense to ignore probabilities, and it's ended up being called Pascal's wager, and this is just the gist of what he argued. Use it for my own purposes. He argued that either God exists or God does not exist, and either you believe in God or you don't believe in God. And that leaves to 4 different categories for outcomes for your choices. So if you believe God exists and you believe in God, you win. If God doesn't exist and you believe in God, well, then you lose. And if you don't believe in God, you lose whether he exists or not. So really, there's only one choice here that leads to a win. The rest lead to a loss. Now, should probabilities affect your decision? Well, imagine if the chance that God exists is very, very small, and the chance that he doesn't exist is very, very high, just for the sake of argument. That doesn't change what the outcomes are. So, which would you choose? Would you call it irrational to choose to believe in God, even if there's a small chance he exists, when there's still a loss in every other decision? Pascal thought it was rational to ignore the probabilities and go ahead and believe in God. So another example we could look at in where we may know accurately what the probabilities are and we can see humans may ignore probabilities is gambling. Why do people play the lottery? Many intellectuals would say it's irrational. Some have said that you're more likely to find a specified grain of sand on the beach than win the lottery. So what do you tell the person that wins the lottery then? That they were stupid, they were irrational for playing? And the person that didn't win, they had the exact same probability of winning as the person who won? So to say it's irrational to play the lottery, it might not be smart if you don't have money. It's not likely that you're going to win, but when you win, you really don't worry about that, do you? So again, ignoring probabilities sometimes makes sense. In this argument, though, as to whether humans are rational at all or are they irrational, I'd like to steal a quote, misapply a quote from Leon Festinger, that these ideas of using these probability calculations to determine human rationality are so bad they're not even wrong. And as Mark Twain popularized as saying, there are three kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics. And so using these probability calculations to argue for human irrationality, I'm going to argue are, yes, definitely statistics. And they're so bad, they're not even wrong. But unfortunately, you can do the math. They're just using the wrong kind of math. So the lesson I wanted to get out of this video is often probability calculations by intellectuals on these areas of human rationality are just simply wrong. And even if they are accurate, even if we could make an accurate probability calculation, it may not be adaptive or rational or logical, whatever name you want to call it, to conform to those probabilities. Yeah, go ahead and send your child to the river because the probabilities over the long run show it's safer. That's great. So are humans irrational? If you define irrational as not adhering to erroneous probability calculations or to correct calculations that have poor outcomes, then yes, intellectuals are rational. If you define irrational as staying alive by adapting to your particular circumstances while disengaged intellectuals scoff, then yes, Forrest, you are irrational. And just a few quotes to once again show that why our intellectuals may have a difficult time in accepting that human behavior, as varied as it is, could be rational. Don't forget to watch my other videos and subscribe and like. Thanks.